Tales of Estolia by Sashina Kerfman. Volume 1. The Promise of Zaccarias. Part 7. Catalyst of Change. Chapter 1. In Hiding. On the eastern shore of Lake Tahoe, Nevada, 2026.
In a blessing given to the 88th Queen of Estolia, she was told that she would have 3 sons, the first to be king, the second to be keeper, and the third to be a catalyst of change and effectively save the planet. Sebastian Zaccarian was her third son, a brooding, somber man. He spent the majority of his time from the age of 16 to the age of 30 amassing wealth. He had a gift for finding ways to bring in profits and yet help many people in the process. The weakest link in all prophecies is the simple truth. Every person walking upon our planet has the gift of free will. No prophecy can withstand the deliberate actions of a saboteur dedicated to nullifying it. Dominic Zaccarian. Inscrito.
Caris yanked a brush through her thick orange-red hair. She ignored the pain of her protesting scalp, wanting only to produce the look Natasha Kinsey required of her housekeeper. It did not take long to tame the wild mass, twist it into a knot, and secure it with a hair tie. She slipped on her undergarments and closed her eyes, running her calloused fingertips over the expensive fabric. After a moment she pulled her hands away. She turned her back on her reflection and picked up the dull blue-gray overalls. The clock over the door to her tiny quarters always ticked loudly. She was once 4 minutes late. The blistering dressing down she received from her employer discouraged her from ever arriving even a minute late. The last item of apparel she tied around her waist was the heavy white apron with a variety of tools of her trade tucked into the pockets. It was 1 minute before 8. She left the tiny room and stopped only long enough to pull the vacuum out of the closet next to her room. She pushed it towards the parlor. It was Tuesday, and she was to clean every inch of the carpet every Tuesday morning. The large grandfather clock in the hallway just began to chime when she switched the machine on and began to vacuum. While she worked, she remembered the expression on Natasha Kinsey's face during the interview. Her nostrils kept flaring, as if she smelled something rotten. Combined with the way her brows twitched toward one another like lovesick caterpillars, Caris had the hardest time keeping her expression blank.
Your hair must either be cut or severely restrained,
Natasha informed her.
Makeup is unacceptable, you must strive to be invisible.
At the time of the interview, she was desperate for a live-in job. Her employer's next commandment almost had her rethinking the job.
Eye contact, Ms. Smith, is going to be a problem.
She proceeded to explain that she and her husband, and their visitors, would not want to be forced to acknowledge her in any way. Eye contact was to be avoided always. It would give all of them a greater level of comfort.
I'm certain you can understand my point of view.
A door slammed somewhere in the house and Caris upped the tempo of her vacuuming. She did not wish to be accused of idleness. The thick pile white carpet picked up the slightest smudge of dirt or strand of hair. One of the parlor doors opened behind her. She trained her amber eyes on the carpet in front of her. While she vacuumed, she repeated the one set of facts that made it possible to live and work in this atmosphere.
5 hours a day, 6 days a week, good money, and only a few more months until my birthday.
This was her second week in this job, and she understood now why they paid so much. Even the least sensitive person on the planet would realize quickly that Brant and Natasha Kinsey would never treat her like she was a human being with actual self-worth. She could only be treated like that for so long before the thought of rebellion would start to set in. She took a deep breath and reminded herself it was only 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, and she would be 24 soon enough. A masculine grunt sounded behind her and she looked up. Brant Kinsey. She did not meet his eyes, following the rules his wife set. She switched off the vacuum cleaner and waited to hear whatever he had to say.
Natasha has gone to stay with her sister for the week,
he said with relish.
I thought this would give us an excellent chance to get to know one another.
Rules notwithstanding, her eyes snapped up to meet his watery blue eyes framed by thinning hair, yellow jowly cheeks and a sloppy jawline. Stepping backward, she said clearly.
I think not.
His face grew hard and mean. His narrow mouth tightened and a white line showed around the edge of his thin lips.
You don't have much of a choice.
The edge to his voice held the tone of the natural bully.
It's not like you'd get another job if we have to give you a negative referral.
In the current financial climate, the threat was real and substantial. She wondered how many of her predecessors chose starvation over the slack, corpulent body of this man. How many chose to sleep with him and realized later that starvation was preferable? She had no doubt over which one she would choose. She let the handle of the vacuum go.
If you try to touch me, I'll break your arm.
Stepping behind the machine, she waited to see what he would do. After a moment of indecision, his jaw firmed while he took in her tiny frame and fine-boned features. To a bully, she probably looked like a perfect target. It was clear he did not think she could win in a fight with him. He was more than a foot taller than she was. He reached for her with an ugly expression on his face. A moment later, he was yelping in pain. She was using a submission hold she learned in a self-defense class. She recalled what her instructor told her.
Don't use it for a sneak or surprise attack, but when approached by a bully, it works exceptionally well.
He yelped again, as each movement on his part resulted in pain.
Most individuals, when faced with this hold, will yield, but some take further persuasion.
She realized her mistake when he backhanded her, knocking her halfway across the room. She landed on a delicate antique table, shattering it completely. She climbed swiftly to her feet, and warily watched him approaching. He shook his right hand a moment or two before advancing on her.
We'll be taking the price of that table out of your paycheck, or you can pay for it now.
His meaning was clear. Her instructor's admonishment came to her.
Sometimes you have to make a strategic withdrawal. You generally don't want to run, don't want to show fear, but some of the male hunters out there are too dangerous, and ultimately your best bet is to elude them long enough to make them grow weary of the chase.
The doorbell began to chime, the long sequence to 4 Elise. Brant looked towards the front door, and that was all she needed to dart past him, and out the patio door. As swiftly as she could, she jumped over the low stone wall separating their perfectly groomed yard from the forest, climbing up the slope behind the property. She did not think he would actively chase her into the forest, but she was not going to risk it and slow down. Unfortunately, she tripped on some hazard and went sprawling, colliding with the trunk of one of the pine trees. Wincing, she rubbed her ankle. She twisted it slightly. She looked down the slope to the Kinsey's house. Brant was chatting with someone on his back patio, but he was scanning the forested slope at the same time he spoke with his visitor. He was not going to accept her escape, if he had the chance. When he turned his back on the slope, she crawled over the shoulder of the hill. She knew the area well. She could go quite some distance without him seeing her. Her ankle hurt, but was able to support her weight.
Catalyst of Change. Chapter 2. Sanctuary.
Societal ills permeating the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century were just one symptom of the sickness plaguing our planet during the years leading up to the project. The study of history became much more popular as scholars and armchair experts tried to trace the event or events that precipitated our crisis. Cause and effect, correlation, and unintended consequences became some of the most popular topics to be discussed both in educational settings and in the very social media network that many considered the root cause of the most heinous of crimes committed in the waning years of my tenure as keeper, and during the first dozen or so years of Nico's. Lazarus Ezekiel Zaccarian, Capitulo 88.
20 minutes later, Caris limped down the drive towards Reardon Cormic's house, her only other employer. She had been hired by a firm to tend his home, stay there, feed the animals, and ride the one horse on the extensive private grounds and public lands adjoining Reardon's property. That job ended when the temp agency told her that Reardon and his wife were returning from an extended out-of-town trip. She was halfway down Reardon's drive when reaction set in and she felt the entire world fade in and out. She fell to her knees and was sick, once, twice, 3 times until her stomach was empty and the black void surrounding her began to take on familiar shapes again. When she tried to rise, her legs were weak. She subsided onto the drive once more to wait for her strength to return. The squeal of brakes needing attention broke into her personal misery. A car was turning into the drive. For a moment, she panicked. She would be virtually invisible in her absurd cleaning outfit. Too wobbly to rise, she did the next best thing and crawled out of the way, hoping the driver would not crush her. The car was driven so slowly, tentatively almost, that the driver had plenty of time to see her and stop. She heard the application of a parking brake, and then a car door opening and closing.
"Are you okay? Have you been in an accident?"
Gentle feminine arms came down around her shoulders, and with the woman's support, Caris was able to get to her feet. Taking a deep breath helped Caris feel more stable, though she was conscious of the unpleasant smell of vomit.
I just had an altercation with my employer.
The woman looked incredulous.
"You have?" "Not Reardon, of course. He is taking a long weekend in San Francisco. But if not him, could you be speaking of Brant or Natasha Kinsey?"
In as few words as possible, she summarized what happened, finishing with,
I'm Karis Smith.
"Melody Cormick.
the beautiful woman said.
Can I take you somewhere?"
The potential repercussions of fleeing on foot suddenly struck her. Trying to keep the shiver of fear out of her voice, she said,
I left my car at the Kinsey house. I'm afraid Brant Kinsey will have my car towed and throw out my belongings. I won't have anything at all if he does that.
"I think not."
Melody said, spoken with her accent. It sounded humorous. Caris sensed that this woman was very tenacious, given a motive. She pulled a cell phone out of her purse and dialed a number.
"Brant, Melody Cormick here. I understand my cousin Caris has been working for you. It appears she left her car at your home. You may drop it off at Reardon's if you like."
That fucking bitch, I'm going to tow her car to the nearest junkyard and have it crushed.
Caris could hear what sounded like angry shouting. Melody waited for him to quiet down before saying softly,
"I understand she could bear testimony against you. While you can afford a top lawyer, keep in mind that Reardon will represent her, and nobody is better than he is, especially when family is involved."
Caris listened in awe to the way Melody dealt with Brant's blustering, bullying behavior.
"I believe she is owed her wages, plus the extra 2 weeks for early termination of her contract, and a bonus of a similar amount for her trouble and medical expenses."
Are you fucking nuts? I'm not giving her a goddamn cent.
More vociferous words she could not understand spluttered over the line. When he came to a halt, Melody said,
"I misspoke. 4 times what she is owed for 2 weeks will be enough. Her face is cut up, she will need a plastic surgeon."
A smile played about her lips during the silence before she added,
"In cash, Brant in her purse and her car and purse brought to Reardon's within the hour."
After she hung up on Brant, Melody drove the rest of the way to the isolated house. For Caris, it felt like she was coming home, to the only home she had known since her mother died. The time she spent watching this house had given her the first taste of freedom she had in months. Melody led Caris to the kitchen and then looked carefully at her face.
"I can stitch that up for you,"
she offered.
Are you a doctor?
Caris asked.
"My 3 sisters and I all chose to become doctors. I studied plastic surgery, and faces are my specialty. If you would prefer, I can take you to your own doctor."
I haven't any health insurance.
Caris admitted. She had been promised that upon successful completion of 3 months of work for the Kinsey family, she would receive health care benefits, but that would not happen now. In 8 months, she broke off that line of thinking. It was unprofitable.
"Then you are in luck,"
Melody said. Caris closed her eyes, trying to ignore how grim her situation was. She should have known that the simple would become complex. In 8 months, Sloane would have no power over her, but if she could not remain hidden and inaccessible until then, his power over her would be complete and irrevocable. An hour later, Caris looked at her face in the mirror. It was numb from the local anesthetic. She had a black eye from running into the tree during her flight. The cut itself was not very large, a small right-angled tear from the ring on Brant's pinky finger. It would scar, but she did not think it would be notable. They heard a ring at the door and Melody went to answer with the droll comment tossed over her shoulder.
"That will be Brant with your car. I will not invite him in."
of Change. Chapter 3. Power Games.
When I first met Michael Othello, I saw him as a man who would have been a credit to Estolia. I wished I could turn back the clock and help him to find the woman who could keep his soul. Alas, history has a habit of being littered with the violent scars of what might have been. In the end, the struggles that Othello went through, the love that he lost, brought Violet into the project. Her role has never been lauded properly, but it was always clear to me that the project could not have succeeded without her, not in time to save the planet. Nicodemus Luciano Zaccarian.
Caris could hear Melody and Brant speaking in the foyer. The conversation was short and shrill. Something about the incomprehensible words made her uneasy. She turned around when the door opened, half afraid that Brant, or even worse Sloane, would be entering the room. But it was just Melody returning. She had a strange expression on her face. She looked like something awful happened.
What's wrong?
Caris asked, stepping towards her. Melody handed her purse to her and then backed away with a look of disgust on her face.
You are Cassandra Taylor-Smythe?
Or Kara Smith for short.
Sloane Danvers is looking for you.
I'm sure he has quite the reward for information about my whereabouts.
Caris admitted. If this woman knew who she was, it was probably because Brant Kinsey snooped in her purse. It would not take much time for him to tell Sloane, and for Sloane to get there, or to send a minion. Fleeing, at this point, was futile. Bleakly, she turned her attention to Melody to ask,
Why such animosity towards me?
was it just the connection to Sloane, or was it something else?
Danvers is a monster.
Melody asserted.
And anyone who would marry him for his money.
She shook her head, shuddering delicately. Furious, Caris held up her hand. Her voice was rock-hard, staccato and emotionless as she said,
My father stipulated I marry a man with the wealth to match my inheritance, dollar for dollar. He wanted me to marry Sloane. But he couldn't stipulate my groom in the will. He couldn't force me to marry Sloane any more than he could force anything else. But if I marry a man with less wealth, the inheritance will go to the Parity Collective.
The political machinations of Parity were legion, and she had no desire to enrich them significantly. She met Melody's eyes steadily when she added,
In 8 months, if I'm still unmarried when I turn 24, the conditions of the will change. And if I'm pregnant and unmarried before I turn 24, then the estate goes to the child.
And Sloane would still have control of the money. He would do everything he could to ensure it was his own child.
It would seem that you're looking for a man to outbid Sloane Danvers,
said a deep, masculine voice.
Reardon!
Melody exclaimed, before throwing herself into his arms. He kissed her passionately while twirling her around the room.
I thought I would surprise you.
Darling, I am so glad you are home early.
She added.
I am, as you noted, in a peculiar position.
She gestured to Caris and said,
This is Cassandra Taylor-Smythe. Caris, this is my husband Reardon.
Reardon turned his attention to her and the expression on his face was clear. He was not sure whether she was worth his notice.
Do I understand the situation correctly? You're in a position to deny Sloane Danvers the opportunity to double his current net worth and deny Parity a similar influx of capital.
Yes, but if Brant Kinsey has communicated my whereabouts to Sloane, it's already too late.
I think the situation can be redeemed,
he said.
Depriving him of that money is, of course, imperative.
He looked at his wife with a tender smile, and then bent to kiss her again.
I'm sorry to so immediately indulge in business.
Just having you home matters more than anything,
she said. He pulled a phone out of his coat pocket and dialed a number.
Seb, I'm calling to find out what you would be willing to do to keep Sloane Danvers from doubling his net worth.
His eyes met Caris's eyes.
You'd have to marry his fiancée.
After a moment, he added,
Today.
He hung up and kissed Melody one more time before saying,
I must draw up a legal agreement. I'll be back.
Once he left, Caris went with Melody back to the spacious kitchen. She could tell that the other woman was still unsure whether she was worth knowing. Melody began cooking something, leaving Caris alone with her thoughts. She was not sure who Reardon called. Was it possible he called the wealthy financier Sebastian Zaccarian? He was more than capable of meeting the stipulations in the will. She did not know of anyone else in the same financial bracket who was free to marry her, or who would be inclined. The scrape as a plate was set in front of her brought her attention back to where she was.
Thank you.
Melody inclined her head, sitting across from her.
Will I curse this day?
Caris considered the question carefully before answering honestly.
If Sloane Danvers and the Parody Collective are as evil to you as they are to me, and your husband's effort to get me married falls through, then I believe you will indeed curse this day.
She looked away and whispered,
I curse the day my father was made to believe Sloane Danvers had my best interests at heart.
At this point, Reardon came into the kitchen. He smiled gently at his wife and said,
My dear, it's time for you to put on your other hat.
He dropped a piece of paper onto the table in front of Caris, and saluted his wife's mouth briefly with a kiss.
You are sure about this?
Melody asked. She looked into her husband's eyes anxiously.
I'm certain this is the only way.
He said.
Zeb will be here soon.
He caressed her face briefly before turning his attention to Caris.
Of Change. Chapter 4. Contract.
It was only after Marsden Taylor Smythe was interfered with that I realized that at least one of the participants in the grand design was using his position and powers to undermine my design. With everything that was riding on our efforts, it was inconceivable that someone would use this time to strike out at me personally. All of the metrics available indicated that this iteration had come much further than any other iteration. The probability of success was high. And rather than work towards the common goal we all shared, it was clear that one of my peers could not stomach the thought of my success. I have a clear idea who it is and why, but cannot write down my suspicions. Every action was, with a sufficient amount of delving, visible to any other participant. If I accused without proof, I would be sanctioned and my powers stripped until I could do little more than observe. I would have to rely upon my own allies and fight more than one evil. Elora, progress report.
Once Melody left the room, the warmth in Reardon's face seeped away, leaving his expression cold and disdainful.
I have no idea, Cassandra Taylor Smythe, if I'm doing a grave disservice to my best friend or not. I can only hope you are not the cold mercenary bitch you are reputed to be.
Caris lifted her chin.
Money is power, Reardon Cormac. Power is merely a force that can be used in many ways. I am tied to the reins of power. Will your friend use the money for good or for evil?
You act as if he will have all your money.
The money reverts to my husband with the requirement that it be passed on to the child that I will have.
She quirked a brow at him.
It's written into the will that the DNA must be tested, and the child be the confirmed genetic offspring of myself and my husband.
He tapped the contract he had placed in front of her.
This is a prenuptial agreement. It states that...
She pushed it back to him, having taken in the salient points.
It's insufficient.
He looked offended.
How? I must warn you that you can expect no more from your husband.
No,
she said.
It must be written that if we dissolve the marriage, he will maintain control of my financial interests. And if he dies, then you, Reardon Cormac, you take over my financial interests. At least until my child is 30.
That's one-sided. I don't think it would stand up in court.
She shrugged her shoulders and said,
Then give control of my finances to the injured party. If he seeks a divorce, I am once again in control of my finances, and if I seek a divorce, he will have this control. Put in a clause that we must seek mediation prior to any divorce, to include your presence. Whatever will protect your friend.
He looked at the contract and tapped it several times.
I believe I could come up with something. I'll be right back.
10 minutes later, he presented her with the revised contract. She read it through and nodded.
I consider this exceedingly fair.
She signed it and then pushed it towards Reardon. She noticed the name for her husband-to-be was indeed Sebastian Zaccarian. She tried to picture him. Black hair, dark eyes, not running to fat, quiet and broody. His name was not a target on social media sites, because from all she read about him, he did not indulge in sexual liaisons with anyone of any gender. The doorbell rang and she stood slowly, wondering if it was Zeb or Sloane. Melody rushed into the room and pulled her out, dragging her to a large master bedroom. Within 10 minutes Karis was dressed in a medieval gown. Melody left her in the bedroom and Karis felt weak-kneed at the thought that she was supposed to marry a total stranger. She shuddered to think what would be happening to her if she did not have that option open to her. She would be safe only when Sloane lost the chance to control her. Reardon asked her,
"Are you sure you want to do this?"
I've never wanted anything more in my life than this,
she said truthfully.
Sloane is here.
She tensed, but there was no place she could run or hide. Reardon led her out the back door and towards a fern grotto she admired when she was house-sitting. She was not surprised to see Sloane or Brant Kinsey. Her attention brushed over them and fastened on the man who was doing exactly what she was doing, marrying a total stranger. Her eyes met his and she walked forward steadily, smiling into his beautiful warm brown eyes. He looked at her like she was precious. Melody was the one who was doing the officiating. As soon as she started the service, Sloane objected. Seb pulled her close. His arms around her, one hand splayed across her abdomen, as they faced off against the man who would do anything to possess her, and the money that possession would bring him. Two older gentlemen who were quietly observing from the background, stepped forward and began to query Sloane, asking for details and substance to his claims of breach of promise. Finally, one of the two said,
"I'm satisfied Sebastian Zaccarian and Cassandra Taylor-Smythe have a sincere desire to wed and see no evidence of a breach in promise. The wedding can go forward."
This was the moment when Sloane would have to decide how much her wealth mattered to him. If she died before she married, he would inherit the entire sum. Sloane started to move forward, but before he moved more than a few feet, the second witness spoke.
I would like to take a moment prior to the nuptials to interject one additional fact.
Sloane shifted from one foot to the other like an uncertain rhinoceros preparing to charge. After a moment the old man continued.
I was with Marsden Taylor-Smythe multiple times over the final days of his life. I believe my testimony, should I enter it, could quite easily result in his entire will being overturned. But even if it stands, I should like to acquaint you with one final codicil he added to his will just prior to his death. He included the provision that if Cassandra were to die prior to the bearing of a child, especially in suspicious circumstances, then her wishes were to be honored, and the entirety of the assets of her father are to go to the Galaxy Group.
Of Change. Chapter 5. Bendelora.
Amador, the second son of Zaccarias, is often overlooked when the history of Estolia is under discussion. Among his many significant accomplishments is the design of our three most critical historical buildings: the palace on Mount Zaccarias, the cathedral next to Mount Estoliana, and the temple within it. Antonio Cordero Zaccarion, Capitulo 85.
The two men argued and dithered with Sloane Danvers, but Zeb's thoughts were on the substance of his Bendelora, the blessing most Estolians received when they turned 18.
Estolia is of little interest to the rest of the world. This is one of the promises of deity. Despite the lack of covetous eyes being cast in her direction, she is threatened by the actions of other nations that court planet-wide disaster. As such, it is time for Estolia to exercise influence over the nations of the world. The burden of this requirement is more than any one descendant of Zaccarias should be made to face. And yet, it is placed upon your shoulders, Sebastiani Alexandros Zaccarian, to meet this extraordinary need. The blessings that will come to you will be more than you can imagine, even as you will feel like the sacrifices you are asked to make are more than you should be forced to endure. Your influence in the greater world will come at a great price, and that is to forego Estolia as your home for much of your life. You will also be given to marry a bride for whom there will be no aura, no advance sanction by the church. You will marry a woman in your 30th year who you have never met, never touched prior to the hour of your wedding. The secular inducement, when the rewards are counted in terms of the good of the planet and thus the good of Estolia, will be impossible to reject. Your willingness to meet the needs of the planet, and by extension Estolia, will result in rewards that cannot be numbered. But if you have the faith to meet and accept your destiny, you will ultimately be filled with the sure sense of right. Peace in all your decisions will be one of the greatest blessings bestowed upon you, a peace that will provide you further guidance.
He held the woman in his arms who would take away the greatest joy any Estolian was given to know in this world. But the sense of sureness when he received the phone call had been immediate. Marrying this woman was a part of his destiny. Denying Sloane Danvers and the Parity Collective made the reasons obvious. He left Estolia after his acolyte year, returning only for his brother's weddings. He would have to see if he would be allowed to use the seclusion suite in the temple, or if he would be denied. The arguments dried up, and Quinton was sharing additional information. When Zeb heard her preference of the Galaxy Group, he hugged her slightly closer. Whatever the reality behind her appearance in his life, it reassured him to know she would go with Galaxy over Parity. Once the objections, as well as the motive for murder, were behind them, Sloane and Brandt left, and they were able to get on with the wedding. In almost no time, it seemed, he was married to a woman whom he had never met, never spoken with. Caris couldn't believe the threat of Sloane Danvers was finally removed from her life. She relaxed in the spacious living room, seated next to her new husband. The older gentleman discussed nuances in the legal situation with Reardon. Melody somehow conjured up catered delicacies and was acting the perfect host. Shortly after the two older gentlemen made their excuses and left, her new husband said,
"I believe it might be in our best interests to absent ourselves, while the seismic impact of our marriage in the business world runs through its paces. In a week to 2 weeks, the dust will settle, and we will see our pathway forward."
Where will we go?
Estolia. One of the few places on the planet where we can be certain we are beyond the reach of Sloane Danvers and the Parity Collective. I have not seen my latest nephews or my niece, and I am anxious to visit with my family.
Reardon asked to speak with Zeb privately, and Caris was left alone once again with Melody.
Thank you, Melody. You saved my life today.
She still did not look like she believed it was a good thing.
Will you divorce right away?
Caris' troubled eyes met Melody's.
Was that the real understanding? That this whole thing was window dressing?
Caris looked away, swallowing on the emotions welling up, fighting back tears. Her voice was monotone as she continued.
If Zeb wishes his freedom, he knows what to do. I don't want to be free. I'll stay with Zeb as long as he can stand me.
She clasped her hands together to quell the trembling. Her knuckles were white and her breathing was shallow.
Are you really as genuine as you would like me to believe?
You should delay any character judgments about me until you get to know me, at least a little.
She heard the men leaving Reardon's study and rose to her feet. The way Reardon wrote the prenuptial agreement made divorce a disaster.
You will take care of our friend Beau?
Zeb was asking Reardon.
It's done already.
Reardon assured him. When Caris saw the serious looks on the faces of the two men, and the suspicious expression on Melody's face, she felt compelled to clarify, blurting out,
For the record, I don't ever want a divorce, but...
She broke off at the looks of surprise on their faces. Clearly divorce was not the subject of their conversation in the study.
But...
Zeb prompted her. She met his eyes and said,
If you want out, please let me be the one to request the divorce.
Her eyes flicked over to Reardon before returning to her new husband, and she clarified.
Reardon wrote the prenuptial contract so that it's best for me to be the one requesting it. Otherwise, I get control of the money back, and I don't want it.
Zeb's voice was gentle.
I do not intend to divorce you. I pledged my entire future to you, Chrysandra. I do not believe in divorce, and I will never ask it of you.
She blushed, feeling like a fool for bringing it up.
We'll see you back here in 90 days.
Reardon told Zeb.
Change. Chapter 6. Dominance.
While passive and disinclined to pursue the military posturing that has been so damaging to the world at large, Estolians believe that deity will only help them if they are willing to help themselves. As a result, one of the more common occupations for young men between the ages of 20 and 30 is the Estolian military. Each man, according to his ability, is a part of the network that keeps us safe. Some become pilots, treating their airplanes and helicopters with almost the same reverence as they would their wives in the future. And some are a part of our naval defenses. Others opt to take on positions of personal safety for the ruling family, acting as bodyguards when the family leave the comfort and security of Estolia. Meredith Zaccarian, Nuances of Modern Estolia.
Karis followed Zeb out to his helicopter.
Where is Estolina?
She asked once they were in the air and heading towards the airport.
Estolia,
he corrected,
is an island nation south of Barcelona, near Mallorca.
Estolia,
she said, getting the pronunciation correct in her mind.
Is it a territory of Spain?
No, it is an independent nation. It is very small and few people really notice it exists.
When he finished speaking, he turned his attention to landing the helicopter near a sleek private jet. She climbed out of the helicopter and followed Zeb over to the jet. A handsome man in a uniform came striding up to them and started speaking rapidly in an unfamiliar foreign language. A third man joined their conversation. They seemed grim. What were they discussing? As the conversation continued, Zeb drew her closer to him, holding her against his ribs. Whatever they were discussing was upsetting to all three men. The third man left their side and walked over to a military jet, complete with what looked like bombs or guns strapped to the wings. When they finished their discussion, Zeb placed a hand under her elbow and guided her into the jet.
Strap yourself in, we are being moved to the top of the queue for immediate takeoff.
Within minutes, they were climbing into the sky. Once they leveled off, she saw the military jet was shadowing them. She turned to Zeb for clarification.
Power takes many forms, Chrysandra Zaccarian. I believe you are more well acquainted with power than the average wealthy young woman. However, few there are who can comprehend and make use of the type of money and power Sloane Danvers and I possess.
He glanced out the window at the military jet.
Sometimes it is all about a demonstration of power. Many animal species have the genetic imperative to breed with the most successful male. When the male red deer with the most impressive rack of antlers shows up, the lesser males give way rather than joust over the females. They see his power and realize they cannot win in a fight. As a result, the male with the greatest longevity nearly always passes on his genes. The same basic structure is seen in the type of power struggles surrounding you, Chrysandra, in that men of great power wish to be the winner and to possess you and your money. It is not as obvious in the beginning, without antlers to demonstrate genetic superiority, which man is the one predestined for victory. What I am doing is showing my power, so Sloane will realize his best course of action is to forget everything to do with you, your power, and the ill-conceived will your father was strong-armed into writing.
She looked from his eyes to the jet outside.
Thus, it remains to be seen whether Sloane is willing to give up, or whether he'll try something more extreme.
She tried to predict what he would do, but could not quite figure it out.
He's a coward.
I diagnosed him as a bully from the beginning. If he is, as you say, a coward, I believe he will not sink any further resources into his pursuit of you.
Turning her back on the window, she focused her attention on Zeb.
What is our itinerary?
We will refuel twice. Because of the need to demonstrate my power but not set either of us up as targets, we will not spend any significant time at either stop.
Why would we have stopped for any length of time?
I was thinking you would want to increase your wardrobe significantly,
he said. His smile lit up his face, communicating more than his words alone.
Oh!
She blushed. For months she had been living on a tight budget, needing to keep off the grid so Sloane could not find her.
I didn't even think about that.
We have a very skilled dressmaker who will make you a wardrobe, and Melody gave me several outfits to tide you over.
That's very kind and thoughtful of you, and of Melody,
she said.
Other than stopping for a quick refuel, we're heading straight to Estolia?
Yes, we will hopefully land by dawn.
Change. Chapter 7. The Sweetest Reward.
With all the international intrigues swirling through the power structures of the mightiest nations on Earth, there was something satisfying in knowing that, at the very least, comparing to the rest of the world, with greed and avarice leaving them in a state of perpetual emotional and moral bankruptcy, Estolia was an oasis of sanity. Every time I returned to my country, my body, self and soul would recharge in the ambience of spirituality, bringing me comfort and peace. I cherished it throughout my youth. I had no idea how deeply it would affect me when that sanctuary was threatened. Sebastiani Alexandros Zaccarian. Inscrito.
What happens when we get to Estolia?
He relaxed slightly and smiled in genuine pleasure.
I am pretty sure my two brothers, my father and my uncle will all meet us at the airport.
He paused, and the pleasant expression dropped off his face.
As an Estolian, normally all marriages must be approved through the church. We may have some religious constraints put upon us when we arrive.
Like what?
She asked, wondering what sort of religion Estolians practiced. Nothing she read about this man mentioned religion. It occurred to her that he might be a member of one of the more restrictive Middle Eastern religions. The unanswered questions swirling through her mind made her realize the enormity of what she had done, tying herself to this man she did not know, for life.
Do not be too disturbed or concerned,
he said with a smile.
Nothing truly bizarre will be asked of us. The Estolian faith has its peculiarities, like most religions, but nothing that you would find onerous or difficult. You would be surprised at the one thing I have done that is contrary to our teachings, and for which I might receive censure.
What did you do?
He grinned. The expression transformed his face and made him seem much younger than her first estimate.
The most egregious thing I did not do was consummate our union prior to the wedding.
That is a peculiar inversion.
She grinned back.
The Estolian faith is unique. It has no analogues in the greater world.
Is it a sin to not consummate the union prior to marriage?
She stumbled over the word, but was grateful for the chance to use his word instead of the vernacular terms that were all too common.
Sin is a Western word. I do not believe that there is an equivalent word in the Estolian language. However, I have broken with tradition. For this reason, I do not know what the leader of the religion, my brother Nico, will have me do as a response. Other young people who have strayed have been banished permanently from Estolia.
You expect to be banished?
No, not really. I do not live in Estolia, and have no plans to live there permanently. Thus, being banished would be immaterial.
His expression grew more somber.
I simply do not know how the leadership will respond.
He reached for her hand, and his thumb rubbed over the skin on the back of it for several moments. The flight attendant poured them both a glass of wine before moving unobtrusively away from them, giving them privacy.
They may require us to spend a week in the temple. That is not unusual. In fact, it is typical. I am hopeful we will be asked to do this thing.
He sipped his wine pensively.
Alternatively, I might be informed I am to be banned from the temple. This is a very real possibility as well.
His eyes locked with hers.
There is even the possibility we will not be welcome in Estolia. This could easily be the last time I will set foot on Estolian soil.
Caris could sense the emotions churning beneath his somber exterior, and wanted to cry out at the pain she sensed. She leaned towards him and set one hand lightly on his thigh.
I hope, Zeb, I don't end up costing you your religion or your home nation. I can't regret our marrying. I needed you to save me, but I hope you don't find the sacrifices you've made are beyond bearing.
He set his warm hand over hers on his thigh, and looked at her, studying her face.
I believe, Chrysandra, on balance I will feel as if the actions of this day were both invaluable and inevitable.
She nodded faintly, hoping it was true.
I feel as though this has been so unfair for you, Zeb. I get to be saved quite literally from a fate worse than death, or from death itself, and you get nothing, or worse than nothing, if you're banished from your faith and possibly your homeland.
He quirked a grin at her, pointing out.
You forget, you have, if Reardon's math is correct, nearly doubled my net worth.
She shook her head.
Not yet. First, I must conceive and give birth, and then we must do a paternity test. Once it comes back that you are the father of the child, Then you lay claim to my inheritance.
His eyes were warm on her as he said,
which of course leads to the sweetest reward for me, and that is to have an extraordinarily beautiful wife and children. You are not the only one who benefits from this alliance.
The flight attendant unfolded a table between them.
I will be bringing dinner out in the next 5 minutes,
she said. Over their meal they discussed a variety of topics. Their earlier intensity passed, and they focused on less volatile and emotional topics. Zeb told her about Estolia as a nation, shared some anecdotes about his 2 cousins and 2 brothers and himself, the trouble they got into, and the brief time they were all at Harvard together. Being the youngest of the 5, he said he was the pest they barely put up with, tagging along all the time. Riordan was one of his best friends at Harvard, and Zeb studied law with him more out of friendship than interest, finding an aptitude for the law exceeded only by his aptitude with money. Melody was one of Zeb's Estolian cousins. Caris had a hard time imagining him as a young insecure boy hanging on to the activities of older boys. He seemed very self-assured, as if he was always in control of the situation and events surrounding him. She believed implicitly that in any high-stakes power game, he would always come out on top.
You mentioned that you have a home in Barcelona?
She prompted. He proceeded to tell her about his home in Spain. His hobby was raising Estolian warmbloods, a type of horse, and he sponsored one promising young equestrian every 3 years.
I was blessed to be able to sponsor Desiree Andorra. You likely heard of her. She works in my stable now. Her horse, Cimitarra de España, won the gold medal in dressage during the Tokyo Olympics. It is not often that a person is able to compete and win against the moneyed elite who normally dominate that sport.
Being a financier and entrepreneur meant he did not have a 9-to-5 job. He seemed pleased to be able to tell her that he would never leave her side.
What good is money if one does not use it to make certain to maximize happiness and contentment all the hours of the day? I do not mean the hedonistic selfish pleasure of some, but rather focus instead on being with my family as my primary obligation.
Caris was not quite sure she followed whatever point he was trying to make. The emotional trauma of the day began to take its toll on her, and after her 3rd attempt to stifle a yawn, he encouraged her to put the seat back and close her eyes. It would be many hours before they arrived at their destination. Zeb went over the blessing he had been given regarding the woman he would someday marry. He was promised peace with each of the decisions he would make, the same peace that flooded his soul when he decided to marry this woman. Clearly, he was receiving the guidance of deity steering him down the pathway of life. Every decision he had made since he received Riordan's phone call that morning felt like he was in an impossible labyrinth with the spirit whispering in his heart which way to go at every split in the road. He would never live in Estolia permanently, but that was knowledge he had been given from the start. He hoped he would be able to partake as fully as possible in the blessings of Zaccarias. He wanted to be able to share his experiences with his brothers and cousins. He wanted to hear the guiding cadence of his uncle's voice as he shared insights into the experiences that Zeb already had. He wanted to see Nico's power grow as the newly appointed keeper of the soul of Estolia, as he, too, shared his interpretations of all that had taken place around him on this fated day. At some point in his musing, Zeb fell asleep next to his bride.
Chapter 8. Sanction.
If we remain sheltered from the nations of the planet, deity has proclaimed that the forces at work will destroy our ecosphere. We must make a change in this world. What victory is it if we remain unknown to most of the world, but are destroyed by the attitudes of those who put profit over progeny? We must make a change, and to do it, we must be more visible. Deity will provide for Estolians when they are willing to keep the promise of Zaccarias and receive the promised blessings in return. Nicodemus Luciano Zaccarian, Capítulo 89.
Nico touched the scroll in front of him. For a moment, he was distracted by the feel of the paper. It was manufactured using an ancient technique, with cotton, wood pulp, seagrasses, and crushed willow eggshells. The edging was thick with the purple and green seagrass found only along the Purple River. The artisans who created the paper in ancient Estolia were true geniuses. He snorted softly as he recognized one way he procrastinated. He would focus on minutiae to sometimes avoid the relevant details that required his attention. He rubbed the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger, and then opened his eyes and focused on the content of the blessing rather than the medium it was written upon. The scroll was written by Kidarin in the elegant calligraphy for which she was known. It was his brother's Bendalora and was lengthy but subtle.
What does Zeb's blessing tell you?
Zeke asked him.
Zeb told me he felt the confirmation of the spirit from the moment he was presented with the opportunity. He described it as a deep and abiding peace once he decided to marry the woman. If deity approves the match and proclaimed from 7 days after his birth that this would take place, we would be going against deity if we were unwilling to sanction the union after the fact.
Nico closed his eyes and thought of his younger brother.
It is essential that they spend 7 days in the temple. He may not be able to give his soul into her keeping, but Zeb will need the spiritual nourishment that comes from the seclusion.
His brow furrowed and he asked,
Has there never been a situation like this?
No, Nico, as far as I can tell, it has never happened.
Zeke looked away into the distance and added,
I actually researched it after his blessing. Uncle Theo set it as my critical study topic to prepare for my future role. The closest I could discover was Zeb's namesake, Alexandros, whose bride was made to marry the heir apparent, sight unseen as her recompense for trespassing on Estolian soil. I recall the day I laid hands on your mother's head while my uncle blessed her. It was clear then that her third son had a holy calling that could not be quantified, and as a result, he would have greater burdens than you or Leon.
The blessings are always greatest for those whose burdens are heaviest.
Nico quoted absently. Suddenly his head came up, and he looked at his uncle sharply.
I believe, Uncle, there may be...
He broke off what he was saying. After a brief pause, he said forcefully,
I know now exactly how I am to handle this. Has the seclusion suite been prepared?
Yes, Nico, it has. I will let your mother know. She will be disappointed to have to wait for a week before seeing your brother. But she knows her family well enough to realize that not being invited to the temple would be devastating for Zeb.
Caris felt a hand on her shoulder and she yawned and sat up. It was Martha, the flight attendant. Zeb was asleep in his seat next to hers. He looked vulnerable.
We will be arriving in Estolia soon. Come with me.
Martha whispered. Caris followed her to a separate compartment towards the tail end of the jet. A beautiful dress was hanging from a hook on a closet door. Martha helped her dress from the skin out. The dress was silver-grey matte-colored fabric with elaborate embroidery in purple, gold, and green. It was off the shoulder and had gauzy translucent strips of fabric that trailed like streamers, making her feel like a fairy princess. White gloves completed the outfit. Once she was dressed, Martha styled her hair. The captain made an announcement in the Estolian language.
Vrijeme leta do Estonie je otprilike 11 sati s predviđenim dolaskom koji se podudara s izlaskom sunca u zračnoj luci Amador.
Martha translated.
We will be landing in about 10 minutes or less.
She followed Martha back to the main lounge, but halted when she saw how Zeb had been transformed. From white gloves, an embroidered cape, a ceremonial sword, to a slender crown, he looked extraordinary.
You look like royalty,
she said after a moment. He held out a hand to her, and she moved forward and took it. Smiling at her, he said,
I am royalty.
He bowed theatrically with a swirl of his cape.
Prince Sebastiani Alexandros Zaccarian, at your service.
He gestured for her to be seated and then sat next to her.
Luckily for me, I have 2 older brothers, so I never had to worry about becoming king.
I had no idea,
she said, her eyes wide as they met his.
That is why you have been dressed in that enchanting gown. By extension, you are now a princess. My 2 older brothers, my uncle and my father, are the 4 most powerful men in Estolia.
While the jet descended rapidly towards the runway, Zeb felt an overwhelming peace wash through him. The same peace he felt when Reardon asked if he was willing to marry Cassandra Taylor Smythe, a woman characterized as a money-hungry harpy, willing to marry one of the most immoral men on the planet so she could double her riches. The feeling of peace had increased when he saw her approaching him in that pleasant fern grotto, a peace that spoke to his soul and proclaimed that this woman was the one whom deity wanted him to marry. He hoped fervently that there would be compensations for his willingness to forego yielding his soul up into her keeping. During his acolyte year, every time he read another account of that moment in the lives of his ancestors, he felt bereft. It was hard to stomach the thought that he would be forced to skip that experience. The only thing that made it bearable was the realization that his willingness to fulfill his birth blessing would be the necessary catalyst to somehow save the planet and preserve Estolia for millennia to come. He turned his head to look at her, and the same sweet peace stole over him again. Deity was telling him that this alliance was the correct one for him. This was where he was supposed to be. Cassandra was the woman deity proclaimed would be his spouse, his lover, his companion, and, if she was worthy, his confidant. Perhaps, he reasoned, he would find a depth of pleasure, joy, and even love with her, and he would never really know what he was missing. He could only hope that this union would fulfill the needs of his soul. The airplane was almost to the ground when he reached over to her and grabbed her hand tightly just as they touched the runway. No matter what his forebears had, what mattered the most was what he had right now, and that was this woman.
Change. Chapter 9. Greeting.
In Northern California, the Hallow River is fed by the snowpack in the mountains. At their base are a trio of towns named Hallows Peak and North and South Hallows End. Several seemingly insignificant events in those three towns were critical to the project. The reconstruction of the dilapidated gatehouse for the gated community of Cubby Lane was one of those factors. Lion of Hath. Essay, The Forces Behind the Project.
Caris held Zeb's arm as they descended the stairs. Just as they stepped onto Estolian soil, the sun burst over the horizon, and the mauve and sepia of dawn were transformed into the bright colors of an Estolian sunrise. Zeb led her to the nearest of four men standing at the base of the steps to greet them. He looked a little older than Zeb and wore a thick ornate crown. Zeb bowed before turning to her.
Cassandra, this is my brother, Leonidas Agamemnon Zaccarian, Duke, Sovereign, and King of Estolia. Leon, this is Cassandra Zaccarian, my wife.
His nod was solemn and his words were stiff, if not quite unwelcoming.
I look forward to having the opportunity to get to know you better over time.
His eyes searched hers, taking in her orange-red hair and short stature, seeing the black eye and stitched cut on her face, and no doubt thinking about the shards of her reputation. The second man Zeb introduced her to was a little younger than the first. He had the classic tall, dark, and handsome look.
Cassandra, this is my other brother, Nicodemus Luciano Zaccarian, last resort, first consul, and keeper of the soul of Estolia. Nico, this is my wife, confirmed by no less than deity, Cassandra Zaccarian.
His expression was as inscrutable as his older brother's. He took her two hands in his, and drew her slightly closer, looking into her eyes. He nodded sharply twice before turning to look at one of the two older men. Her hands were still clasped in his. When he turned back, he said,
"Forgive me, my dear. In person, you seem nothing like your reputation on social media sites."
His smile, when it came, was sincere, and when he pulled her into his arms for a hug, she felt as if his greeting was all that she could have asked for. Once he let her go, he bowed towards her and then held up one hand.
"Brother, it is essential that you and your new wife go directly to the temple to spend 7 days in the royal seclusion suite which has been prepared for you. At the end of the 7 days, the Spirit will speak to me and tell me all I need to know about this event. Then, and only then, will we know for sure if the marriage is sanctioned."
Zeb's eyes met his brother's, and for a moment they shared some silent communication. He let his breath out, as if he had been holding it, and started to turn towards the two older men. He stopped when Nico said,
As keeper of the soul of Estolia, all other introductions and interactions beyond those prescribed by your time in the temple must be curtailed. You will have time to greet everyone once your 7-day period is at an end. Go now, direct to the temple. We will have our interview after 7 days. He gestured to the other carriage. You are expected at the temple. May all the promises of deity come true and permeate your life, your marriage, and your future. May you fulfill your Bendelora.
Knowing she would not be living in Estolia, and that she might never return, she chose to focus her attention on her husband during their journey, rather than on the countryside. It was the first time she really looked at him. He was perhaps an inch or two shorter than 6 feet, which still made him tall compared to her 5'0" frame. He had black hair and warm brown eyes, a firm determined chin, thick eyelashes, and high cheekbones. His shoulders were broad, and she recalled the lean strength of his body when he pulled her against him during Sloane's challenge to their marriage. He was the supreme male animal, the deer with the most impressive rack of antlers, to use his peculiar analogy. He was her mate. She felt the prickling of her nerve endings when she realized she would be on intimate terms with him. He broke the silence to ask,
Do you use contraceptives?
No.
She was short in her response. What else could she add to that one word?
I hope we will begin a family when you are ready, Cassandra.
I would like that.
She added.
I normally go by the name of Karis. I don't mind Cassandra, but I thought I would let you know.
Thank you, Karis. I think both names are delightful.
The carriage had been following a road around the base of a tall mountain. Soon they were traveling in a narrow valley between two mountains. The one they had been circling had two structures that caught her attention. One looked like a medieval cathedral, while the other looked like a facade to a temple of some kind, against the face of the mountain itself.
This is Mount Estoliana,
Zeb explained. He gestured to the building standing near the mountain.
Normally a wedding is a private affair, focused only on the two people joining their lives. But the children of royalty have a special ceremony here in the cathedral, after their seclusion, to allow the citizens of Estolia the chance to get to know the newest member of the ruling family.
His expression was wistful as he looked at the cathedral, as if he was uncertain whether he would be allowed to have that royal ceremony. She hoped, for his sake, that they would.
The temple is within the mountain. At its heart is the royal seclusion suite, where we will spend 7 days. It is expected that royalty, sons and daughters of the king and keeper, spend the first 7 days of their union together there. At the end of that time we will have an interview with the head of the Estolian faith, my brother, and we will find out for sure what our future will be.
Are we completely isolated for the entire 7 days?
She asked him. He shook his head.
It is supposed to be a spiritual experience of some magnitude, and I was willing to forego this time if necessary, if deity asked it of me. But it appears we will be blessed to have this time together.
The carriage pulled to a halt near steps leading to an immense set of double doors. 2 young men in monk-type robes opened the doors of the carriage. Zeb helped her climb down and then together they approached the double doors of the temple. Inside they faced a foyer with brown and gold tiles. Another smaller set of double doors were at the end of the fan-shaped foyer, and there were halls to right and left. She held his arm as they walked slowly towards the double doors. As they approached them, he explained.
Normally, I would bring my prospective bride here to the temple, to this ceremony room, and we would then be sent to the seclusion suite for 7 days. We are not considered married in Estolian law until after the 7-day period and the ceremony that follows.
Another set of somber-faced young men opened the doors they were approaching. The room inside had a raised dais towards one end with an elaborate gold, purple, and green pillow resting on it. Several young men created an aisle, making it obvious they should climb onto the dais. Zeb looked at his bride as they approached the dais, and he wondered if he was being given silent instructions. She looked at him, and in that moment he was glad he married her, glad for the trials he was currently faced with, and he finally, fully accepted the role he was given years before he was born, and the place he inhabited in this and the greater world. He halted her and instructed her to kneel on the pillow. While it was not his place to give blessings, he felt the need to lay his hands on her head and take a moment to thank deity for giving him so much guidance in his life, much more than the average Estolian received. She looked up at him, and in the moment before she knelt, he took in her appearance a little more closely than he had before. She was barely 5 feet tall, with long orange-red hair, large amber eyes, and a curvy figure. Her face was swollen and she had stitches on a right-angled tear near her left nostril from where she had been struck prior to his meeting her. She had a black eye. Once she was kneeling on the pillow, he placed his hands on her head lightly. Speaking aloud in the Estolian language, he offered up his thanks to deity, to Zaccarias, to Estoliana, and to more than 80 generations of Estolians who always did the right thing in the interests of preserving the paradise of Estolia for all time. He accepted his role in the greater world, of somehow influencing world events, and helping to turn the tide of power hunger so they might, as a planet, move forward on a quest for peace and mutual beneficence. His time away from Estolia, and the knowledge he would never call it home again, led him in different pathways, bringing to him the extraordinary wealth through which he was able to secure this woman to his side. He felt the same wash of peace come through his body and his soul, and knew he was given an extraordinary role. He took a deep breath, and then helped Caris to her feet.
Catalyst of Change. Chapter 10. Seclusion.
The disaster in Nico's office, my future office, led to the strangest and most offhand prophecy I ever read about in all my time as keeper. But when I saw the finished result, I knew with certainty that my uncle's vision was as influenced by deity as any blessing might be. Could he have predicted the actual character of that massive boulder, or that I would be on hand at its discovery and recognize its worth? Orion Octavian Zaccarian. Capitulo 90.
Caris got to her feet at Zeb's urging. His expression was thoughtful. He looked more at peace than he had up until this moment. Something deeply personal took place during the time his hands were on her head, and he spoke in his native language. Personal and peaceful. She took the arm he proffered and they descended on the back side of the dais towards yet another set of double doors. Those were also held open for them. On the other side of the doors was a larger foyer with the same tiles. Several doors and hallways led off in many directions. They walked towards the only set of double doors. When they reached them, they were opened and Caris gasped in delight at the sight that met her eyes. In front of them was a wall of glass, and on the other side of the glass was a garden, with beautiful trees climbing into the sunlight festooned with large pinkish-white blooms. A meandering pond wandered around the garden with numerous large fish swimming lazily within. Inside the seclusion suite to their left was a seating area where one could admire the beautiful courtyard from inside. To the right was a large half-moon-shaped table that looked like it could seat 6. Beyond a small seating area to the left was a lustrous tapestry-like wall hanging fringed in gold, with elaborate designs in purple, gold and green. It was held back by a thick golden velvet rope. On the other side was an enormous bed. She could see a bathroom just beyond the bed. The glass wall facing onto the natural courtyard continued uninterrupted from the small sitting room to the bedroom. Zeb's voice was quiet when he said,
I think, my dear, the best plan right now is for the two of us to have a nap, get some sleep. It has been a very long day for us.
He led her into the bedchamber, handed her a long silky white nightgown, and asked,
Do you wish to use the facilities first?
She nodded and took the nightgown from him. When she was finished taking a shower, she felt curiously vulnerable stepping out of the bathroom wearing only a nightgown. Zeb came up to her as she stepped out of the bathroom and handed her a glass of golden sparkling wine. Holding his own glass up, he said,
To our alliance. May we make something truly wonderful out of it.
She raised her glass to his toast, and then sipped the wine, stopping to savor the delightful flavor. He topped her wine off and then stepped into the bathroom for his own shower. She sipped at the wine a little longer before moving to the bed, and slipping under the covers on the side that was already turned down. She felt awkward, knowing she was going to sleep with Zeb. He probably knew her reputation for promiscuity. What he could not know was that it was all a sham. For just a moment, she allowed her memory to flow back to the 2 years after her mother died. Her father understood money and high finance, but was lousy at parenting. She asked to move into an apartment of her own once she was 18. She thought he was secretly grateful for her taking herself out of his home. Shortly after she moved into the spacious apartment in the Carpathia building, she invited Charles to live with her. Rumors were rife on the internet about their relationship, especially when a few photographs were leaked by Charles. In retrospect, she was not sure what she hoped to get out of the sham relationship. Charles had his own motives, and she knew he benefited from their time together. Nobody in his repressive family circle suspected his interest was in men. Her father told her that she would be written out of his will if she were to marry Charles, or any other man without his approval. She had a few uncomfortable conversations with him, but for the most part, so long as she did not marry Charles, her father ignored her. She had hoped to explain the situation to any man she became seriously interested in, if that ever happened. Once her father's plans for her were made known to her, she had been fighting against the clock to remain single and not become pregnant. Marriage to Sloane, or single motherhood were both disastrous. Zeb was wearing chocolate brown pajamas. When he left the bathroom, he crossed the room to where his glass was resting and took a sip of the wine, before pouring more wine in the glass. He carried both his glass and the bottle of wine over to his side of the bed.
A little bit more?
He asked, proffering the bottle of wine. She extended her empty glass to him, and he filled it with the last of the wine. She watched as he went to the thick tapestry wall hanging, and untied the velvet rope. Once released, the tapestry closed the bedchamber off from the rest of the suite. He moved over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pulled another sash, bringing down similar wall hangings to cover the windows. The bedchamber was thrown into darkness with only the light from the bathroom shining into the bedroom. When Zeb slipped into the bed, Karis was not sure what he was planning. Did he really mean sleep, or did he mean to go about consummating their alliance now?
It will take a couple of days to get adjusted to this time zone,
he said. Then, after a pause, he asked,
May I hold you, Karis?
She scooted closer to him and into his arms, her head pillowed on his shoulder. She could hear his heart beating rapidly, which told her more than anything else that he was not nearly as relaxed as he tried to appear.
I am looking forward to introducing you to my family. It is important to me they get to know the real you, rather than the caricature that has been bandied about online.
She set her hand on his chest, feeling his heart thumping against her hand.
Zeb,
she whispered. He looked at her, and whatever he saw in her eyes must have told him something. He tilted her chin upward and leaned over to kiss her. He pulled back slightly to look at her in the dim light of the bedchamber, and then kissed her again, brushing his tongue lightly over her bottom lip, encouraging a response from her. His mouth left hers, and moved to her neck and the back of her ear before whispering.
May I take your nightgown off?
She could say no, but his warm body against hers was heating her core. She sat up and allowed him to remove the nightgown. The touch of his mouth on the crown of one breast had her calling out in pleasure. She ran her hands over his back, slipping them under the waistband of his pajamas, caressing his buttocks, enjoying the way his skin twitched and muscles tensed in response. He cupped her intimately, his touch eliciting a rush of heated desire. She felt as though her nerve endings were being dipped in pure sensation. She pushed the pajamas down, encouraging him to be as naked as she already was. He needed no further invitation, and in moments the warmth of his skin was pressed against her, the heat of his arousal against her thigh.
Zeb,
she said again, urging him closer. He claimed her lips and body at the same time. Karis sucked in her breath at the pain as he took her purity from her. She knew he did not expect her to be a virgin. What she did not expect was for it to hurt quite so much. His tempo changed from undisciplined passion to gentle persuasion. Afterwards, he pulled her close against him, almost crushing her in an embrace, comforting and soothing her. The emotions of the last 24 hours, on top of 3 glasses of wine, and the physical trauma of her altercation with Brant Kinsey all contributed to her weariness, and she fell asleep to the sound of Zeb's heartbeat in her ear.
There are more women
Zeb could not believe where his faith led him. Regardless of the reports on social media and her unsavory reputation, she was pure. He had been willing to sacrifice the most extraordinary gift from deity, the sensation of having a woman take his soul into her keeping, the chance to experience vicariously through that close connection what it was like to nurture a child from conception to birth.
With thoughts of a child, his hand covered her abdomen, and he realized that, if the promises of Zaccarias were to be believed, she would conceive a son.
Their son.
This extraordinary woman gave him the gift of herself.
Selflessly, having felt what it meant to place his soul in her keeping, he now understood what he had been asked to willingly give up in light of the needs of his nation and his world.
But, as his blessing stated, he had been rewarded for his willingness to make that sacrifice by having Caris take his soul, and show him the profound joy felt by those who came before him.
Body to the web, the exquisite pleasure of that virgin marriage bed.
Nico knew, somehow, that Caris was pure. He would ask the time-honored question and he, Sebastian Zaccarian, would be able to answer honestly that his soul was in her keeping.
The union would be sanctioned after the fact. He would not be denied his land or his religion.
His true sacrifice was in not living in Estolia, a future he had known his entire life. He looked forward to the conversations he, his brothers and his uncle would have. He anticipated the marriage blessing they would receive would be powerful, perhaps giving some further clues as to how he would make a major difference on their beleaguered planet, a planet sick to its very soul of the pestilence of power hunger.
When with the soul of my soul, the ceiling of my heart, I yielded up my soul to her, and safe she took it in her keeping. She took it in her keeping, when with my body to the web, the exquisite pleasure of that virgin marriage bed.
Of Change. Chapter 11. The Pathway of Faith. Our isolation from the squabbles and petty bickering of the rest of the planet has kept us out of many conflicts that would otherwise have torn us apart. There will, however, come a time when as a nation, Estolia will have to step in and take a greater hand in the events shaping the world. At some point a leader will emerge who will be able to bring together the factions of this planet and procure a secure and lasting change in the deep enmity driving mankind to war. Maximiliano Sebastian Zaccarian, Capitulo 85.
Caris woke to the feel of a hand on her breast. She rolled over and smiled at the man who had possessed her a few hours earlier.
"Hello,"
she said.
"I hope you are feeling well rested."
He moved closer to her, brushing the hair out of her face before kissing her gently.
His tongue brushed against her lips, seeking access and then taking advantage of her yielding to him. His kiss grew more passionate. She felt the heat of his arousal growing between them.
As his mouth danced with hers, she explored his body with a greater sense of sureness.
Her fingertips enjoying the tactile sensation of his silky skin over firm muscles.
The eventual merging of flesh felt more significant than their coupling earlier. Now she felt as if Zeb was more than just the man who saved her from Sloane Danvers.
She would have come to care for him if they met and dated like ordinary mortals.
After, he held her closely while their heart rates slowed down. It was obvious that Zeb was much more than a means to an end, and for the first time she was grateful for the absurd will her father wrote.
She never would have been brought into Zeb's orbit without it.
Later he climbed out of the bed and held out a bathrobe for her and then donned a similar one.
Zeb guided her out to the tiny dining room. She opened the refrigerator and saw a note that said, "Meals are provided. Open the door to request your meal." She passed Zeb the note, and he chuckled when he read it.
I knew those who entered this suite would be pampered.
He went to the double doors and pushed one open. She heard him exchanging a few words before he closed it.
We will have a meal delivered in less than 15 minutes.
As they prepared for bed on their last night in the seclusion suite, Caris mentally reviewed the previous 7 days. They were visited on the third day by an elder with a bilingual copy of the Adeos of Marriage for Elders. Even though Zeb would not be partaking of the elder year, the note explained that the contents within were important for anyone marrying in the Estolian manner. They had been given several blessings. After the last one, they were told the blessings would be transcribed and for her sake, translated and presented to them. The blessings were necessary, no matter how extraordinary it was to be given so many. As the catalyst and conduit of change, they were both instruments of fate and deity. Guidance was the one thing deity planned to give them in abundance.
What will happen tomorrow?
Caris asked Zeb.
Tomorrow my brother will ask me about the consummation of our union.
He smiled at her wryly.
From an outsider's perspective, it might seem bizarre that such a personal topic would ever be asked openly, but if you consider it, we have been reading some of the erotic exploits of my ancestors in the Adios, Capitulos and Ensayos. Our culture is very open about these things. One of the things I was not promised was that my wife would be a virgin. To an Estolian man, that is a tremendous sacrifice. I was asked to give that up in the interests of Estolia and of the planet. I was willing to fulfill my destiny, marry the woman that fate would decree to be mine, and by doing so, I was willing to give up the most exquisite connection any human being can ever experience.
He broke off what he was saying, and Caris was surprised to see the glimmer of tears on his lashes.
I was willing.
He repeated in a whisper.
I don't understand, Zeb.
He closed his eyes and took several big breaths before finally continuing.
I shall explain more fully at another time. Share with you some of the most critical teachings of our faith. If a man is willing to embrace the teachings and the promise of Zaccarias, he can expect an extraordinary connection with his wife-to-be. There is a profound spiritual and physical connection between them that cannot be severed.
I'm still not sure I understand.
He rolled away from her and asked,
What are you feeling right now?
She responded promptly.
I don't like it when you move away from me. I feel lonely.
He moved close to her, holding her tightly against his body.
And now?
When we touch, I feel extremely close to you. It brings me happiness.
You keep my soul, Chrysandra Zaccarian. As such, you connect with it and know what it wants. It knows its rightful home is with you, but it still wishes contact with me. When we touch, my soul is happiest. This will never change. I will never wish to be apart from you for any substantial length of time.
He smiled at her, and then reached for the capitulo they had been reading. He flipped it open to one page and said,
What does this say?
She looked at the lines he pointed out and read from it.
Faith to the sons and daughters of Zaccarias is in believing the promise. Zaccarias made to deity will result in the blessings deity proclaimed would be their reward. Faith rewarded to each Estolian, rewarded with tactile, spiritual, extraordinary precision. Faith.
She looked at Zeb and smiled, somewhat puzzled.
Look again at the page and note the placement of my hand.
Zeb said. She looked at the book he held. Like all the books they had been reading, it was a dual translation copy, with the text on the right in English, and the text on the left in the Estolian script. Zeb's hand was placed over the English translation. She had been reading from the Estolian.
How is that possible? I have only been studying the Estolian language for a week.
The words in Estolian just made sense to her when she did not think about it.
Because, my dear, you keep my soul. When you relax, you discover my soul helps you in this transition to living with me in a foreign nation. We will not live here permanently, of course, but we will visit. Our children will grow up bilingual.
He picked up the book and set it on the bedside table, turning off the light at the same time.
I no longer worry about our coming interview. I look forward to it with an acute sense of joy. However, my wonderful Caris, I think tomorrow will come soon enough. For now, the two of us should enjoy the last night of our seclusion.
Change. Chapter 12. The Promise of Tomorrow.
When I first read the entire translation of the blessing I received on the day that Zeke became the last resort, my emotions were tumultuous. Humility, hope, excitement, awe, and then wonder. Wonder that they could say I would have 3 sons, all of which would have some pivotal role in the world and in Estolia. Perhaps it was asking for more than I deserved, but I longed to have the promise of a daughter along with 3 sons. My joy in Rhiannon's birth was more acute than for my sons. Deity proclaimed I would have 3 sons with great futures, so I embraced the answer to my fervent prayers when I was first confirmed pregnant. Lelaine Zaccarian, Ensayo 88.
The next morning, she donned another beautiful dress, resplendent in the colors of Estolia. While she was brushing her hair, he approached her and settled a delicate tiara on her head.
As a princess, you must dress the part.
He grinned at her in the mirror. When it was time, he extended one gloved hand to her, and she took it, feeling that same rush of happiness at his touch. They returned to the oval chamber she remembered from when they first arrived in Estolia, where he had her kneel on the dais and he laid his hands on her head, very much like the many blessings they had received during their seclusion. This time standing on the dais were the same 4 men who greeted them when they arrived, 2 of whom she was introduced to, Zeb's 2 older brothers, and the 2 who were not. She and Zeb climbed the dais and stood in front of the 4 men. Zeb pulled her to stand in front of him, and he settled one hand over her abdomen, his other arm wrapped around her just beneath her breasts, holding her close. Nico stood wearing his elaborate robe, looking somber. All the men were dressed in, she guessed, the full regalia of their office and station. He stood slightly forward of the other men.
As the keeper of the soul of Estolia, I ask you, Sebastiani Alexandros Zaccarian, to provide cause for the spirit and the nation to sanction your union with a woman whose aura was not visible to you and to whom you wed without intimacy, specifically for secular reasons. Why should your union be sanctioned when you scorn many of the precepts of Zaccarias?
Zeb pulled her tight up against him for a moment before easing his hold.
I, Sebastiani Alexandros Zaccarian, have placed my soul securely within Chrysandra Zaccarian's keeping. Having been commanded by deity to marry a woman unknown to me, without aura, possibly without purity, I was willing to fulfill my obligations to my nation, my family, and ultimately this planet. Having followed the demands of deity, I ask now for the sanction of our union to be declared openly that it might be so recorded.
Nico looked at her.
And you, Chrysandra Zaccarian, did you willingly give up your purity and take his soul in recompense?
She did not know what to say to that.
I was pure and untouched until Zeb made me his.
Do you wish to remain with this man, or by the teachings of Zaccarias, would you prefer to reject the man whose soul you keep securely?
I shall never reject Zeb, never,
she said with vehemence.
Kneel,
Nico commanded. Caris knelt on the pillow, recalling yet again the first time she was in this oval chamber. This time it was not her husband's hands on her head, but Nico's, and a second set of hands. She could feel Zeb's hands on her shoulders. The blessing was in the Estolian dialect. She would receive a translation. If she tried very hard, she might understand some of what he was saying. Instead she chose to feel the moment, absorb the spiritual impact of his words. When he finished and Zeb helped her to her feet, she was now Estolian. In her heart and soul, she embraced the faith. The peace that washed over her was different than the peace that came with touching Zeb. This was deeper, more profound. She was not sure if deity was what she was feeling. But she was certain of one thing. Being with Zeb, keeping his soul, loving him was her true destiny. He understood now why the seclusion suite mattered so much. The time spent mostly alone, together, was like the time spent allowing cement to dry. The focus was on the connection between the couple. Now that they had the solidity of their union, they could look upon the greater world with a new perspective.
He had never appreciated his world and his nation so much as in that moment, when he stepped out of the cathedral, formally married to the woman at his side, with all his life spread before him and the enchanting reality that she would be with him every step of the way. This nation was worth keeping and preserving. Much of what he had read made more sense now than it ever had before. He would do everything in his power to promote the future prosperity of Estolia, and by necessity the planet. He glanced at Caris and was dazzled by her brilliant aura. It was blinding in its intensity, shimmering with the purity of her soul, and entwined within, he could recognize the substance of his own soul. This vision, fading rapidly, was yet another gift from deity, allowing him to experience all that he was willing to sacrifice, as a reward for that self-same willingness. Caris looked at him, and he thanked everything within himself that he was gifted with this woman. She was everything any Estolian would want. She gave him the courage to continue listening to the guidance of the spirit, so he could fulfill his destiny as the catalyst of change, and somehow save the planet.
The promise of Zaccarias binds the generations to one goal, one soul, one objective. Deity's gifts, the glorious aura, the keeping of the soul, the stray errand, the temple Archailes embrace, the proof of our faith. The promise of Zaccarias binds the generations to one goal, one soul, one objective.